This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
There's a greater than 80% chance if emissions stay below here of not exceeding 2 degrees. But if emissions go up to here, there's less than half a chance of not busting through the 2-degree ceiling. So somewhere in here, a betting person who is fairly risk-averse, but not entirely risk-averse, would want the world's trajectory of emissions to go. And the key thing to understand here is that emissions globally would have to peak somewhere in the decade of the 2020s, no matter which your risk aversion profile is, whether it's to avoid 80% likelihood of success or less than 50% likelihood of success. And that's going to be damn difficult to do. And the reason is that the developing countries' economies are growing fast, pouring out emissions very fast. It's not apparent how we would turn that around in the course of the next 15 years or so. But the key question we are faced with there is, what policies, institutions, international and domestic arrangements, treaties could we institute? What are the general framework which could give us a good chance of either meeting the 2-degree threshold, or if we don't meet it, avoiding sitting above it for very long? And that's what I want to close this talk by discussing at a very general level. What are the policies? This rather grim photo was from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and it underscores the importance of adaptation. It used to be that the developed countries haughtily thought that adaptation to climate change was somebody else's worry. The developing countries were poor, they were going to have the biggest impacts. We're smart, we're rich, we can deal with it. There has been episode after episode of failure to deal with climate extremes in the last 5 or 10 years, which has convinced the developed country governments that adaptation is everybody's problem. It is likely that the industrialized developed countries will try to help. If we're ever going to have an international climate agreement, they're going to have to provide some resources to the developing countries to help them with adaptation. But we're going to have to spend money in Australia and the United States and Europe also on our own adaptation. At the Copenhagen meeting, one of the successes, the recent conference of the parties, one of the major successes was a commitment by the developed countries to shell out substantial amounts of money, $30 billion in the next 3 years, $100 billion over the next 10 years, to facilitate adaptation and emissions reduction in developing countries. We'll see whether they actually pony up the money. They don't have a very good track record of meeting such commitments, but it helps. Even making the commitment and starting the money flow helps making developing countries willing to talk about reducing their own emissions. Again, I'm going to apologize here for a U.S.-centric point of view. I don't have the details of what Australia is doing, although I've been hearing an earful of it this week. These were U.S. proposals. Number 2 thing you want to do is, after you've got an adaptation plan in place, is start capping domestic emissions. In the U.S., these are all the different legislative proposals. This is the emissions as they have been. These are the legislative various proposals to bring emissions down. This is business as usual if the U.S. Senate in its wisdom continues to do absolutely nothing. And the point is, it's a lively legislative debate in the U.S., which has been derailed, at least temporarily, by the economic situation and by our discussion of what to do about health care. But there are proposals ready to go for bringing down emissions, and most of them are based on the domestic emissions trading schemes. I don't want to advertise what Australia should do. Every country will do its own thing and probably do it quite differently. There are a multitude of choices of what to do to control domestic emissions. Emissions trading is one way. Command and control, imposing regulations on energy use is another. Taxes are another. Every country will find its own way to approach it. The third point that needs to be dealt with is perhaps the most important one. It can only be dealt with in the context of an international agreement or set of agreements among several countries, and that's who has to reduce by how much. This is a discussion that's just gotten going. It was also a success of the Copenhagen meeting that for the first time the developing countries were willing to actually put down numbers for how much they would, for their own domestic purposes, be willing to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Countries like South Africa, China, India put down credible or at least semi-credible numbers. The reason this discussion is so difficult is here we see the total emissions from China Well, China just passed the United States as the world's biggest emitter. It can no longer hide out behind the other developing countries. On the other hand, per capita, Chinese emissions are a fourth of what U.S. emissions are, and India's emissions per capita are something like a tenth or maybe even a 20th. I can't remember the exact number of what U.S. emissions are. U.S. emissions per capita are about double what European emissions are, and I think Australian emissions per capita are even worse than U.S. emissions. Australia, Canada, the U.S. are the sort of outliers. And again, we see this bar chart I showed you before. Those developing country emissions are increasing. So deciding on what the burden sharing is, what in the language of the UN Framework Convention is the common but differentiated responsibility of countries, creating financial institutions like the international emissions trading system that's been proposed and that's been implemented in Europe to facilitate financial flows. This will be a very big part of it. I don't think that there's going to be a mega international agreement, as some people thought would come out of Copenhagen, for some time, but there is going to be cooperation, bilateral agreements between countries on what to do about this problem. I'm not discouraged about that part, but I actually think Copenhagen was a step forward.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.